KaraokeBooks.
The Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom. Tobias Smollett. Audiobook. Chapter 48. Count Fathom unmasks his battery, is repulsed, and varies his operations without effect. Every necessary preparation being made, Rinaldo, accompanied by our adventurer, took the road to Dover, where he embarked in a packet boat for Calais, after having settled a correspondence with his dear Ferdinand, from whom he did not part without tears. He had before solicited him to be his fellow traveler, that he might personally enjoy the benefit of his conversation and superior sagacity. But these entreaties he strenuously opposed, on pretense of his being determined to push his fortune in England, which he considered as his native country, and as the land in which, of all others, a man of merit has the best encouragement. Such were the reasons he alleged for refusing to attend his benefactor, who was himself eagerly desirous of attaining a settlement in the island of Great Britain. But our hero's real motives for staying were of a very different complexion. The reader is already informed of his aim upon the fair orphan, which, at present, was the chief spring of his conduct. He may also recollect such passages of his life, as were sufficient to deter him from reappearing at Presburg or Vienna. But, besides these reflections, he was detained by a full persuasion that Rinaldo would sink under the power and influence of his antagonist, consequently be rendered incapable to provide for his friends, and that he himself, fraught with wiles and experience as he was, could not fail to make himself amends for what he had suffered among a people equally rich and unthinking. Melville, having embraced our adventurer, and with a deep sigh bid him take care of the unfortunate Monimia, committed himself to the sea, and, by the assistance of a favorable gale, was in 4 hours safely landed on the French shore, while Fathom took post horses for London, where he arrived that same night, and next day, in the forenoon, went to visit the beauteous mourner, who had as yet received no intimation of Rinaldo's departure or design. He found her in the attitude of writing a letter to her inconstant lover, the contents of which the reader will be acquainted with in due time. Her countenance, notwithstanding the veil of melancholy by which it was overcast, seemed altogether serene and composed. She was the picture of pious resignation, and sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. After having paid the compliment of the morning, Fathom begged pardon for having omitted to visit her during 3 days, in which, he said, his time had been wholly engrossed in procuring a proper equipage for Count Melville, who had at last bid an eternal adieu to the island of Great Britain. At this information the hapless Monimia fell back in her chair, and continued some minutes in a swoon, from which being recovered, "Excuse me, Mr. Fathom," cried she with a deep sigh. "This, I hope, is the last agony I shall feel from my unhappy passion." Then wiping the tears from her lovely eyes, she retrieved her tranquillity, and desired to know by what means Rinaldo had been enabled to undertake his journey into the empire. Our hero, upon this occasion, assumed the whole merit of having promoted the interest of his friend, by giving her to understand, that he, in consequence of an unforeseen windfall, had defrayed the expense of the Count's equipment, though he observed, that it was not without reluctance he saw Rinaldo make a wrong use of his friendship. "Although I was happy," proceeded this artful traitor, "in being able to discharge my obligations to the house of Melville, I could not help feeling the most sensible chagrin, when I saw my assistance rendered subservient to the triumphs of the youth's baseness and infidelity, for he chose, as the companion of his travels, the abandoned woman for whom he had forsaken the all-perfect Monimia, whose virtue and accomplishments did not preserve her sacred from his ungrateful sarcasms and unmannerly ridicule. Believe me, madam, I was so shocked at his conversation on that subject, and so much incensed at his want of delicacy, that my temper was scarce sufficient for the ceremony of parting. And, now that my debt to his family is overpaid, I have solemnly renounced his correspondence." When she heard that, instead of betraying the least symptom of regret or compassion for her unhappy fate, the perfidious youth had exulted over her fall, and even made her a subject for his mirth. The blood revisited her faded cheeks, and resentment restored to her eyes the poignancy which sorrow had before overcome. Yet she scorned to give speech to her indignation, but, forcing a smile, "Why should I repine," said she, "at the mortifications of a life which I despise, and from which, I hope, heaven speedily will set me free?" Fathom, fired by her emotion, which had recalled all the graces of her beauty, exclaimed in a rapture, "Talk not so contemptuously of this life, which hath still a fund of happiness in store for the amiable, the divine Monimia. Though one admirer hath proved an apostate to his vows, your candor will not suffer you to condemn the whole sex. Some there are, whose bosoms glow with passion equally pure, unalterable, and intense. For my own part, I have sacrificed to a rigid punctilio of honor the dearest ideas of my heart. I beheld your unrivaled charms, and deeply felt their power. Yet, while a possibility of Melville's reformation remained, and while I was restrained by my niggard fortune from making a tender worthy of your acceptance, I combated with my inclinations, and bore without repining the pangs of hopeless love. But, now that my honor is disengaged, and my fortune rendered independent, by the last will of a worthy nobleman, whose friendship I was favored with in France, I presume to lay myself at the feet of the adorable Monimia, as the most faithful of admirers, whose happiness or misery wholly depends upon her nod. Believe me, madam, these are not the professions of idle gallantry. I speak the genuine, though imperfect, language of my heart. Words, even the most pathetic, cannot do justice to my love. I gaze upon your beauty with ravishment, but I contemplate the graces of your soul with such awful veneration, that I tremble while I approach you, as if my vows were addressed to some superior being. During this declaration, which was pronounced in the most emphatic manner, Monimia was successively agitated with shame, anger, and grief. Nevertheless, she summoned her whole philosophy to her aid, and, with a tranquil, though determined air, begged he would not diminish the obligations he had already conferred, by disturbing with such unseasonable addresses a poor unhappy maid, who had detached all her thoughts from earthly objects, and waited impatiently for that dissolution which alone could put a period to her misfortunes. Fathom, imagining that these were no other than the suggestions of a temporary disappointment and despondence, which it was his business to oppose with all his eloquence and art, renewed his theme with redoubled ardor, and, at last, became so importunate in his desires, that Monimia, provoked beyond the power of concealing her resentment, said, she was heartily sorry to find herself under the necessity of telling him, that, in the midst of her misfortunes, she could not help remembering what she had been. Then, rising from her seat, with all the dignity of displeasure, perhaps, added she, you have forgot who was the father of the once happy Monimia. With these words she retired into another chamber, leaving our adventurer confounded by the repulse he had sustained. Not that he was discouraged from prosecuting his aim, on the contrary, this rebuff seemed to add fresh vigor to his operations. He now thought it high time to bring over Madame la Mère to his interest, and, to facilitate her conversion, took an opportunity of bribing her with some inconsiderable presents, after having amused her with a plausible tale of his passion for Monimia, with whom she undertook the office of his mediatrix, on the supposition that his intentions were honorable, and highly advantageous to her lodger. She was, first of all, invested with the office of obtaining pardon for the offense he had given, and, in this negotiation she succeeded so well, as to become an advocate for his suit. Accordingly, she took all occasions of magnifying his praise. His agreeable person was often the subject of her discourse to the fair mourner. Her admiration dwelt upon his politeness, good sense, and winning deportment, and she every day retailed little stories of his benevolence and greatness of soul. The defect in his birth she represented as a circumstance altogether foreign from the consideration of his merit, especially in a nation where such distinctions are as little respected as they will be in a future state. She mentioned several persons of note, who basked in the sunshine of power and fortune, without having enjoyed the least hereditary assistance from their forefathers. One, she said, sprung from the loins of an obscure attorney. Another was the grandson of a valet de chambre. A third was the issue of an accountant, and a fourth the offspring of a woolen draper. All these were the children of their own good works, and had raised themselves upon their personal virtues and address, a foundation certainly more solid and honorable than a vague inheritance derived from ancestors, in whose deserts they could not be supposed to have borne the least share. Monimia listened to all these arguments with great patience and affability, though she at once dived into the source from which all such insinuations flowed. She joined in the commendations of Fathom, and owned herself a particular instance of that benevolence which the old lady had so justly extolled. But, once for all, to prevent the supplication which Madame la Mère was about to make, she solemnly protested that her heart was altogether shut against any other earthly engagement, and that her thoughts were altogether employed upon her eternal salvation. The assiduous landlady, perceiving the steadiness of her disposition, thought proper to alter her method of proceeding, and, for the present, suspended that theme by which she found her fair lodger disobliged. Resolved to reconcile Monimia to life, before she would again recommend Ferdinand to her love, she endeavored to amuse her imagination, by recounting the occasional incidents of the day, hoping gradually to decoy her attention to those sublunary objects from which it had been industriously weaned. She seasoned her conversation with agreeable sallies, enlarged upon the different scenes of pleasure and diversion appertaining to this great metropolis, practiced upon her palate with the delicacies of eating, endeavored to shake her temperance with repeated proffers and recommendations of certain cordials and restoratives, which she alleged were necessary for the recovery of her health, and pressed her to make little excursions into the fields that skirt the town, for the benefit of air and exercise. While this auxiliary plied the disconsolate Monimia on one hand, Fathom was not remiss on the other. He now seemed to have sacrificed his passion to her quiet, his discourse turned upon more indifferent subjects. He endeavored to dispel her melancholy with arguments drawn from philosophy and religion. On some occasions, he displayed all his fund of good humor, with a view to beguile her sorrow. He importuned her to give him the pleasure of squiring her to some place of innocent entertainment, and, finally, insisted upon her accepting a pecuniary reinforcement to her finances, which he knew to be in a most consumptive condition.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.